All right, once again, my name is Stefanie Bautista. My full name is Stefanie Solomon Bautista, and I am Filipino American, and I am born and raised here in Los Angeles, not too far from, not here, this is Anaheim, but I've been coming to Anaheim many, many years, going to Disneyland pretty much all my life. And I am a former teacher in the public school system, but now I'm a programs coordinator for anything after school. So basically what I do is I use my love of, fandom, comics, pop culture, anything to connect with my students outside of the school day. I know how powerful it is that teachers, they do such wonderful work inside the classroom during the school day, but the after school period is really where you get to connect with these students on a different level. And I make sure that I can find programs, sports, electives, arts, anything you could possibly think of, just to spark their interest in something that they might not have known before. So I'm really all about creating opportunities for our youth from TK all the way to 8th grade and maybe even beyond to high school, just to let them know that there is such a big world out there and so much to discover. And really using the Happiest Pod and also being here at WonderCon, it's such a great platform to find mediums that can cater to every individual out there. So I'm really excited for the discussion we're going to have today with these talented people to my left, and looking forward to seeing what we can get to.
And once again, my name is Ariel Landrum. My full name is Ariel Matugas Landrum. We do give our panelists the option to say their full name, because if you are part of the AAPI community, sometimes you have a chosen name or other given names that don't get to be honored, so this is an opportunity to highlight them. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I work with a lot of AAPI clients, and I specialize in working with military members and their families, members of the LGBTQS+ community, who intersect with essentially being military members and their families. I also work with a lot of individuals of survivors of sexual assault. All of those communities intersect with each other, and my goal as a therapist is to honor their experience and their story, to highlight that I am not the expert of their story, but instead I want to be a full witness of their story and find levels of healing that maybe they weren't privy to for whatever part of their experience that was not witnessed or authored in the way that they needed it to be.
Hi everyone, I'm Lorran Garrison. I am a school psychologist in San Diego. Hey, San Diego, shout out. Yes. Let's see, I grew up on the island of Luong. I am biologically half Vietnamese, half Filipino, but I grew up with an African-American father, so I didn't know I was actually half Filipino until the age of 27. I have a very interesting background, including, my mom used to be a former cult member. I mean, I can keep going. But this is one of the reasons why I became a school psychologist, right? Sometimes we go there because we have to figure out our brain, right? So what I do as a school psychologist, because not a lot of people know what that is, and so they ask me, what do I do? So what I do is I specifically assess kids on their cognitive level, which means I give them IQ tests, and I, figure out if, do they qualify or not qualify for special education? What does that mean? Do they have normal cognition, typical IQs? Are they within the norm of a bell curve? What is expected of children their age? And are they developmentally appropriate? So the reason why I say this is because I'm up here, not only am I representing from somebody who grew up on Guam until I was 18, a Vietnamese background, Filipino background, sort of African American, I don't really claim that anymore, but sort of that. But also I'm here to represent the folks that are neurodivergent. So what does that mean? Neurotypical is usually a descriptor that describes someone who is within the average range of standard processing, behavior, thought process, right? So now neurodiversity, which was coined by a sociologist named Judy Singer, who was autistic in 1997, so this was her thesis. And so neurodiversity can be broken down into two categories of people, one who are neurotypical, the average, and those who are neurodivergent. Neurodivergent is, usually referred to specifically people who are autistic, but now the term has been broadened. So now neurodivergence now refers to any structured or anybody that might have, different ways of thinking like ADHD, anxiety, depression, bipolarism, the whole thing. But, here at WonderCon, I'm going to introduce, as inspired by Loki, another term. And instead of being divergent, because I find the word divergent to be exclusive, I'm going to introduce the term neurovariant. Thank you very much, Loki. Loki. Neurovariant, I feel with the word with the term variant variety is more inclusive. And it's basically, people with developed minds that are different. So that's my spiel. So thank you so much for coming here. Thank you, WonderCon. Thank you, CalmOn, for having us. Thank you guys for coming and listening to us. And I will get off my soapbox.
Okay. You can do it. Roll.
I know. It's like our first con in 2 years, so it's so wonderful to be here. And it's so wonderful for y'all to join us and to come together with us. This is so great. So my American name is Elizabeth Smith, or Dr. Smith, and my Korean name is Yi Pang-shil, Pang-shil being my Korean name. And my pronouns she, her, hers. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, so I actually share a lot of identity factors with a lot of the panelists up here, and probably some for y'all too. So just to kind of locate me, I'm also a military brat. I am half Korean and mostly Irish on my dad's side. As a licensed clinical psychologist, I also do assessments like Lorraine. I also do treatment. I have a few other letters up there for specialties regarding autism spectrum disorder and trauma-related things. I work with a lot of different folks. It's so wonderful. I work with people of all ages, families, and I also get to train emerging psychologists, which is a really amazing thing, to also help them work with not only people with diverse cultural backgrounds, but also a lot of neurodiversity as well. And what else? I mean, I'm just so stoked to be here. I don't even know what else to say. It's just so exciting. So I'm just going to pass it on over. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Angela Luong. I have some training in autistic children with their behavioral motor function as well as speech, but mainly just speech therapy. And I am also a co-founder of CalmOn, which was a project that I started during the pandemic with Farrah. And we were both very passionate about wanting to educate younger children from 6 through 11 about mental health. And here we are wanting to talk about how youth go through a lot of mental health issues at a younger age, as we all have experienced it at some point as Asian Americans. And we want to advocate on that. So I'm really excited to be here. My pronouns are she and her. And one of my favorite passions is singing, dancing, all kinds of creative arts. And I'm really excited to be here, guys.
So hi, I'm Farrah. This is my first con ever, so it's really exciting to be here. I'm Chinese American, and I am a UX designer, and people don't usually know what that means. So basically, I understand what users are going through, and then based off of that, I empathize with them, and I create those user experiences, whether it be on like mobile apps or websites or like on your laptop. So what Angela was saying was that like I worked on this side project, which is CalmOn, and because of when I was little, I like emotionally suppressed all my feelings, and then I was thinking about creating this app where letting people know that it's okay to feel what you're feeling. Like, it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be angry. You shouldn't get punished for feeling those feelings. And then it's just like an app that I created to heal my inner childhood. Yeah.
Awesome. So the way it's going to work is we're going to have a couple questions for all of us panelists, and one thing we have all in common is that we're all super fans of many, many different things, which is why we're all here at WonderCon, right? Clearly, we are all dressed as something that we love. And so we're gonna try to answer these questions from our own lenses. And first of all, we wanna identify what AAPI actually is. AAPI is the acronym for Asian American Pacific Islander, who are an integral part of the American cultural mosaic, encompassing a wide range of diversity. This term is used to describe a fast-growing population of 23 million Americans, roughly including 50 ethnic groups with origin in more than 40 countries. So like we said earlier, we're not a monolith. There are so many different people, so many different cultures, so many mixes of cultures. We are so diverse in our own group, and we are just a drop in the bucket, like Ariel said. And it's really exciting to see more and more faces that look very similar to us in pop culture, and that's one of the things that we want to dive into today. So our first question is, what or who do you think of when you think of AAPI representation in pop culture? This is maybe like a first person you think of, first group you think of?
So for me, if I were thinking of like my childhood self, I would definitely think Mulan, and I would definitely think Jasmine, and Sailor Moon. And that was it. And none of them really phenotypically looked like me, but I was like, oh, that's me. That's me. I know that person. That's me. That's how I act. That's how I want to be. That's what I want to. Before then, it wasn't cosplay. It was costume for Halloween. And then as I got older, I started searching for particularly more Filipina and Filipino, and I wasn't finding it. At least I wasn't finding it as a main character. I wasn't finding it as someone that I could point and say was me. And it was always like the joke of the guy in the chair. And I was not. I would say that I was not what is considered the stereotypical moral minority myth Asian. I was not very smart. I actually had a learning disability growing up. It was very hard for me to track what I was reading. I would have to fill in the blanks of a sentence, which made it very hard for test taking. So I started to think that maybe I wasn't ever going to be represented. I'm glad that's changed now in my adulthood. But as a child, that was really scary and really sad for me, to have to look around and not see myself reflected. And I should also add, as a military brat, my dad moved around a lot, and we landed in Kansas, where I graduated with a class of 12 people, and I was the person of color in my town, and as you can see, I'm very white passing, so that is that was really scary to be considered the person who was diverse. And I didn't think that I was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Jasmine, because I love Jasmine because she was dark-skinned like me, and then I found out her singing voice was a Filipina, and that blew my mind, but also low-key confused me, because I was like, why did they just make her like that? Anyway, and the only other person I could think of was Tia Carrera, who was in Wayne's World. And, not a movie that maybe I should have been watching back then, but she was amazing. She could sing. She was like a badass. She was badass. Yeah. And that was the only person that I could think of for a really long time. And I agree with everything you said. Lorran?
Oh man, I'm old. so let me tell you who I looked up to as a kid growing up. It was Bruce Lee. So that was my guy, right? But then there were all these Asian stereotypes, right? So you got Green Hornet, and then you get Dave Carradine, who played Kung Fu. Did you all watch that? Mm-hmm. And so I didn't understand that he was actually white. I was very confused about that. Let's see, and then all the stereotypes growing up on an island, we have a lot of military bases, and so what people knew when they came to Guam, was very limited. So that was South Pacific, the Broadway show. There's Miss Saigon, there's Madame Butterfly, Full Metal Jacket, Me Love You Long Time.
Yes.
So it was, and then the comic books I read growing up to help me understand what my family went through, because there was nothing else. And Nam is from an American soldier's point of view. And so I'm, that like, I remember being a kid when we were looking for my family while they were like refugees from the Vietnam War. I remember very specifically, it must have been first, second grade, and my teacher asked everyone to draw what they wanted for Christmas. I drew a picture of my family, right? Very cute, and it's very adorable, but to me, they were exotic. Like, I didn't know what they looked like. We didn't have any pictures. And to me, growing up on Guam, there's Pacific Islanders, we're all Asian, we're a mixture of Asian, you're either Chamorro, Filipino, Korean, Chinese. So to me, they were exotic. People who came from the military bases were exotic to me. Blonde and blue-eyed, because in my culture, blonde and blue-eyed are considered ghosts. So very exotic. So I'm drawing a picture, and my teacher is like, "What's this?" I'm like, "Oh, that's my family." Turns out 6-year-old me drew my family as blonde and blue-eyed. So I had no idea, and my dad thought it was the funniest thing and saved it, and I was so ashamed. I was so ashamed of that, but he, and that made me think about my cultural identity. What did that mean? Who am I, right? So it was like, my only role models were, these like either the dragon lady or, Asian stereotype of the shoe when you're gonna go hit your kid with the shoe, right? So,
Tiger mom.
Yeah, the tiger mom. Thank you.
Gotcha, girl.
Yes, thank you. So those were my influences, and then I had anime, but different story.
Yeah, I actually was fortunate enough to have my grandparents with us, like when we were living here in the U.S. And I mean, granted, I moved to the U.S. like early in childhood, but with my grandparents and with like family around, we would actually drive 4 to 5 hours out of town to go rent videotapes, like cassette tapes, of Korean TV shows. And and we would have like boxes of these VHS tapes. And of course, the grandkids like me were in charge of rewinding them. Not with a pencil though, right? No. Yes. And as the oldest granddaughter, that was like a big like deal for me. So I still had some representation, and I still had, fortunately, like some aspects of language and culture and music and things that were very normal to me. And so at first, I don't think it really occurred to me how much it was lacking in US media, like initially. I also think that, very similarly, there were definitely moments where I didn't always understand how different my family was. But, so it's kind of also the same thing with food too, because we cooked food at home. So even in some of the very rural or, different areas, it didn't occur to me that like, oh, there's not a Korean restaurant in this city or this town. Because I was still eating that food and I was still making it with my grandmother. So it didn't really occur to me like, oh, well, where does everyone else buy their kimchi? And so, so there were some moments like that, but definitely I think I have to, give a shout out to some of the characters that were actually rather flat, like the Yellow Power Ranger, right? But then there are some that were a little bit more full, like Babysitter's Club, or if we're looking at Gilmore's Girls, right? So there are some that were a little bit fuller, and at the same time, there are also these like cool athletes, right? Like Jeremy Lin, and then of course we also had these wonderful artists like Jim Lee, who did the wonderful X-Men series that I grew up with, as well as Wildcats and like several other things. So that was like really cool too. But I definitely understand that there was a lot of growth that was still happening. And also, I think one of the things about cartoons in the 80s and some of the representation then was there were a lot of characters that weren't necessarily people. So there were the Smurfs, there were, Transformers, there were, lots of different kinds of representations of people without it necessarily occurring to me as a young child, like, I don't really see myself represented. Because the conversations about being different and a lot of the conflicts were a lot of times still very present. So when I think of AAPI representation, and then also, when we talk about AAPI, like, I also still want to include Canada, right?
Yeah.
Like Canadian. So maybe this is like North American, but maybe we're just talking about like the Asian diaspora as a whole. And so there's also that aspect too. And so yes, there are definitely times when things were not really well represented, as well as times where things like food and things were not really well represented. Where people are like, oh yeah, this is Chinese food. It's like, is it though? Because I don't know. And then there are of course times, when I get particularly like, there's almost an anger that comes out I guess we'll talk about that too with some of the other things.
Yeah.
When some things are just really not hitting the spot. So, even when it came to food, if I go to a restaurant and they have really awful kimchi, I'm like, this could be someone's first and only time that they're ever going to try this. Why did you put so much sugar in it? Like, what just happened to this? This is so offensive. When I think of AAPI representation, I think of some of the great things, I think of some of the not so great things, as well as some areas where I may not have been as aware.
Either of you have anything you want to add?
Oh, I do. Yeah, so when I was little, I didn't really feel I had any AAPI representation in media. I remember when I was little, I would always go to Chinese school after school, and I would be like, why do I have to go? Why do I have to learn Chinese? I'm American. Like, I can't believe I said that. That's like so embarrassing. It's because I was all like, why do I have to learn Chinese? Like, I'm in an English-speaking country. Like, why do I need to do that? But now as I'm older, I understand, this is where I'm from. Like, I should be learning this. This is like my whole family background. Like, I just wish like back then we had Disney movies like Raya and Mulan, but that was like only one. And also Turning Red that just came out. That was I felt like I was meaning. I was like, that was literally me being portrayed. So yeah. And then like I guess one person in media that kind of resonated with me was Ming-Na Wen. She voiced Luong, and she was also in the Joy Luck Club, and that was like one of the first movies I've ever watched with like everybody was Asian in it, and I was like, whoa, that's crazy. And I was like, I really felt those characters because I understood like how their mother and daughter relationship wasn't that strong because the mothers always had these really high expectations for their daughters, and I was like, that was me, like. So I understand where she's coming from now, but like back then I didn't understand why she was treating me so harshly, but I was like her act of love towards me. So.
I think for me, I could relate to a lot of Turning Red as well. I definitely cried a lot in that movie because there were a lot of things in childhood that I felt like was repressed between me and my family members. And I couldn't say, I couldn't disobey my parents, even though I wanted to disagree with them. So Turning Red for me, also, just like Farrah, we similarly agree that it is a great representation, partially to our childhood girls, Asian Americans, and wanting to be perfect. And I always wanted to be a perfect person. I wanted to look skinny. I wanted to have perfect grades. I wanted to be that ideal child, but I never did. I was just this emotional mess. That's how I felt when I was younger. But when it comes to the question of Asian representation growing up as a kid, I was super, super obsessed more with American pop media. like music as well. Britney Spears, NSYNC, just the celebrities that were non-Asian. I did listen growing up to a lot of Cantonese pop in the 80s and 90s. And when I was 6 years old, beginning at 6, my parents would always remind me that the first time I was singing in the backseat of my car was Cantonese pop. You know, the big stars, Andy Lau, Stan Chun, those people. But I never showed that side to my American friends at school. And I always felt like I had to split that personality at home versus having another different personality at school.
Code switching.
Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Code switching.
Yeah. I always wanted to speak English, for example, right? I couldn't speak Cantonese in English in American schools. But when I think about like people I looked up to, I don't think there were many Asian American celebrities and artists that I looked up to as much, other than Luong from Disney. And also, I would say Lucy Liu. When I became like an adolescent, I started watching Kill Bill Volume 1 and Charlie's Angels, like the whole spy assassin. That was so cool. I was like, oh yeah, like I would love to be like kicking people's butts. Just like her. But it's totally different to help what we were dealing with when we were younger. We just felt like we had no control of things. So I really looked up to Lucy. However, she definitely had some good representations of Asian Americans as well as some bad representations of Asian Americans.
So the next question, I feel like we touched upon a lot of that. If there is Mulan, our beloved Mulan, because obviously there's a lot of pieces that did resonate with us as an AAPI member, whether it be negative or positive. So the next question is, can you identify instances that media has misrepresented or underrepresented AAPI identities? I know we have maybe mixed feelings about this, because as I feel more and more content is coming out that might be representative, like we've touched on before, it might not be exactly what we thought it would be. And a couple of things come to my mind, but do you guys have anything that comes to mind when you think of this?
Well, I think of the slide that says that we like encompass 40 different countries. And I would say that when it comes to representation, when I talk to friends who are not in the community and I ask them about AAPI, they first think East Asian, and that's kind of it. And that was always sort of like what became a comparison to. And when it came time to thinking about the representation, it was always someone who was very light-skinned. It was always someone who was the best friend, I think, and if they weren't the butt of the joke, they were somebody who was like had some sort of impossible standards, and that was kind of it. That's where I think the misrepresentation is, and I think we were talking about like Tiger Mom, like from an outside lens looking in at that family. Yeah, okay, you could say that is someone who's like domineering, but you're not when you're in the family. It's not domineering at all. It's coming from a place of love. Like you understand that these high standards are set, especially if you have an immigration story where it's like, it took a lot to get us here. We don't want to lose everything that we've sacrificed. And as a clinician, hearing stories from other AAPI diaspora, that becomes this strong narrative of my friends don't understand. Like they think that I should just cut my family off. I should ignore my mom's phone call. I should like not respond to my dad. You know, why do I care what my grandparents think? Like this doesn't make sense. It's like hard to explain that, let alone put it in media when you are not in the community trying to represent this thing that you're looking from the outside in.
You're 18, you should move.
Yeah. You're 18, why aren't you out of the house? You're 20, why aren't you out of the house? You're 24,
Right.
why aren't you out of the house? Right. Why are you asking me why I should be out of the house?
I am just putting my card out there to say, I could have voiced that.
Yeah.
And if they're gonna bring Dr. Wong back, I'm totally down. Just putting that one out there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I really love that they brought in that character. And right, and yes, they could have done things a little bit better. Could have. Same time, it's cool. It's still cool. I'm taking it a lot.
So I know we've talked a little bit about this, but how do you honor AAPI representation in your profession? I know all of us work with many, many different types of people. So I'm just curious to know, how do you integrate maybe your culture or maybe, you know, things that you've learned or things you've learned along the way that has to do with AAPI representation in your everyday practice?
I think just to touch on this quickly, as a therapist, we have to take this thing called continuing education, where you continue education. And one of the things you have to learn is, they call it cultural competency. I don't think you can ever be fully competent of another culture. Cultural humility, you're learning. And a lot of the times, anytime I took one of those classes in regards to AAPI, it was someone who was not in the community teaching it, and it was very diluted to like know about Lunar New Year and know that they like their family, and that was kind of it. And so for me, I took it upon myself to start making continuing education about AAPI experiences, what an AAPI person might be struggling with when they enter your space, and how to work with them, and how the idea of working with family. Like, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and most of us, even though marriage and family is in there, we do like individual therapies. So a lot of times it was like, no, think of the family not as just like the immediate unit. Expand it out. Get releases of information for the acupuncturist. Get releases of information for like clergy. Get releases of information for people who are mentors, who are elders in the community. That is family. That's just as close as my mom, dad, and sibling. And that to me was how I expanded representation in the profession.
Yeah, as for me, I'm usually the first therapist any family interacts with. And so it's really important because I want to make that first impression. I see high school students right now, but my range can be anywhere from six years old all the way up to 22 years old. But usually mine is related to the education system. However, some of these students, because they come from this colonialized mindset, don't even realize that they're coming from a collective mindset. And so I have to explain to them that the school system is supporting this individualized individual system, and it's not honoring your collectiveness, your collective family culture. And so I saw this kid who is Filipino, and that blew his mind. He never realized, because he was so frustrated that, you know, every single teacher he went to, and they told him, well, you gotta make your own decision. You can't worry about, you know, your parents' divorce, blah, 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 blah. But he has to, because that's part of the collective thought. That's part of his responsibility. He's part of the family. They make decisions together. And then he was like so hard on himself, he couldn't believe it. And then he came to me, we spoke, and he was like, oh, this makes so much sense now. You know, like it like shined some light in this corner of his mind that was just so dark and depressed, because he was like, I can't, you know, he couldn't figure out why he couldn't do that. I'm like, because it goes against your values. And no one ever really talked to him about his values. And so, you know, I come from like, you know, island Black, you know, Vietnamese, Filipino value. And so whomever I see, I'm like, what's your value? What's your family's value? Because, you know, it might be different than somebody else's. And so no one's ever talked to them about their values, their family values, what's important to them. That's my soapbox. Sorry.
No, for sure. I also work with young kids and families as well, and it's definitely a huge piece in many different ways of, you know, thinking more collectivistically versus, and in some ways, more Western thought process. But also, you know, these very real important pieces of decolonizing mental health. Because like even when you think about like, oh, who are famous psychology people? And people oftentimes think like old white men.
Yeah.
And you know what? There are so many forms of healing that happened way before that that are absolutely valid and very important. And then a lot of it, you know, is taken and then resold to people like, oh, mindfulness.
Yes.
Like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, you know,
What does
that's
that
only,
mean?
you know, been around for thousands and thousands of years. That's cool. That's awesome. But so there are lots of different pieces like that, but even like in reading exercises, so many people will talk to people and they're like, oh, okay, you're gonna do a breath of 4 counts. I'm like, cool, yeah. You're talking to a group of Asian people and you're telling them to do a count of 4, which is that left.
It's death. What it means.
Yeah.
It means death.
So how was I supposed to calm them down? Right? And so there are just like some aspects like that. But also I think it's really important to mention that statistically speaking, when they look at the data, Asian Americans seek therapeutic services the way that they identify therapeutic services, by the way. So they seek that about 1/3 the rate of people who identify as white. So that's also a huge, huge piece. In addition, it's also pretty important to acknowledge that Asian American women between the ages of 15 and 24 have the highest rates of suicide when it comes to, right? And what's happening for someone who's 15 to 24? Their sexual identity is developing.
Yeah.
All of this fetishization, all of these different pressures, right? How is this really impacting them? So that's a huge, huge piece too. I think it's really, really important to do a lot of outwork, like free therapy services. So I do a lot of stuff with the Asian Mental Health Collective. They actually have things like the Lotus Fund, which will pay for 8 free service sessions. There are, you know, lots of different nonprofits to work with, and lots of other things that are so important. Sorry, go ahead. I can just blab on. So go ahead. Seriously.
I just want to add, there's intergenerational trauma
Yeah.
too, and so that's something that we should talk about too. And like, you know, whether it's in the Asian culture or even the Black culture, Pacific Island culture, you know, we have to think about like, what have we absorbed from, you know, all this generation. I mean, there's positive too. They have uplifted us and put us where we are and making us a better person. But let's look at the collective intergenerational trauma too. So
Yeah, definitely, especially for people who have had lots of war and lots of things where they have been in survival mode.
yeah.
And it's so difficult if you've been surviving to then be the, you know, person who's now able to be in thriving mode.
And that expectation,
Yeah.
right? That expectation.
Because you also want to pay that back to the family and, you know, keep in mind all of their sacrifices. That's another huge, huge thing.
That's another panel.
That's another panel. Yes, exactly.
Angela, Farrah, do you have anything that you want to add about
I know we're
your
running out of
profession?
time.
So for me, it's a little bit different as like, not that much, but it's a little bit different as a UX designer. So when I design, I have to be culturally aware of who I'm designing for. For example, if I'm designing for people in Asia, that way of experience is going to be way different than the Western experience. For example, like if I'm putting images on an app and I use like different poses or different signs, like in some places that can be very offensive, but in Western places it can be, oh, that means okay, right? So I have to be very culturally aware of who I'm designing for, and I really like to do research on that, so I'm not being offensive to anybody or in that kind of way. So that's how I do my research on that.
For me, I work with Asian families to take care of kids and teaching them how to, speak and do basic motor functions that can help with their daily routines. And I'm just really proud that I have a very open-minded, diverse community that I grew up with as a young kid. And so now I have, met different backgrounds, not just Asian American and Asian friends within my social and Asian, community, but also getting to make friends who are in the Latin American community and way more outside of that, which allowed me to apply that to a profession that keeps me open-minded and to stay, grounded with people of different backgrounds that I may have conflict with because I don't understand their cultural perspective yet. And it's very, very important to, instead of being angry or just not really truly understanding why they said certain things to you, it's very important to ask certain guiding questions. Learn about who they are instead of asking of just, oh, what do you need or what do you want? It's like, okay, let me take some time to get to know this person, although we aren't really working well right now, but let's see where they're coming from and try to adjust some strategies and techniques that could help with, children and their, behavior and motor, issues that we can create solutions for. And sometimes even what was taught in school for, your professions and certifications may be different for different families with different cultural backgrounds. You've got to adapt to those different backgrounds or, families that may be educated or not even educated on mental health and things like that. There's many factors.
I know there's so much more we can talk about, but I know our time is up. I know the next panel is going to come in and start setting up, but thank you so much for lending your ear. I know this conversation is far from done, but if you want to scan the QR code to access our contact info, if you want to talk to us, we're going to be outside. But thank you so much for just being here, hearing our stories, coming together with us, like the panel says, and we do appreciate, everything that, you all do as professionals.
I want to really shout out that we have an AAPI all-women panel, and that was just so beautiful. Happy and the fact that WonderCon has 2 AAPI representation panels and is featuring a film called Movie of the Vengeance. Like, come on.
Yes, thank you very much, WonderCon, Comic-Con, for having us and being open-minded in that sense. Really appreciate it. Hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your con, and if you have any questions, come and chat with us. Love to chat with you guys. Come see us outside.
Thank you.
Everybody have a good night.